Welcome, everyone, and welcome to the C20 Summit. I am Sanjita Pant. I'm a fellow at Accountability Lab, and I will be moderating today's session on anti-corruption priorities for the G20 in 2021. Anti-corruption remains a key priority for the G20, and with the current G20 anti-corruption plan coming to an end, this is a crucial point at which to support the development of new ideas that can shape this agenda. And civil society has an essential role to play in this process, particularly by providing feedback and ideas to the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group. In this session, an overview of the Italian anti-corruption priorities will be presented, followed by feedback from experts for the G20 to consider going forward around the priorities. Recordings and summaries of outcomes of this session will be forwarded to the relevant G20 Working Group as well as the other structures. In the run-up to the G20 anti-corruption ministerial meeting, the Crime Congress, as well as the UN Special Session on Corruption, now is the time to push the agenda. I would like to encourage all those listening in to make this session, to try and make this session as useful as possible by sending in your comments and as well as questions during the session. You can use the chat box to do that. You could also share your thoughts by using the hashtag C20 Summit. Now, without taking a lot of the panelists' time, I would like to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves in a few sentences and tell us why corruption matters to them. I would like to first request Mr. Alfredo Duranto Mangoli from the co-chair of the anti-corruption G20 anti-corruption group to begin. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the C20 chair for the invitation to participate in this panel. I am an Italian career diplomat. I am a coordinator for anti-corruption at the Italian Foreign Ministry since June 2016. Before, I've been a diplomatic advisor to the Justice Minister. And in my current capacity, I partake in the main multilateral fora active on anti-corruption, integrity and compliance as part of the global agenda, the ANCAC, OECD, GRECO, Council of Europe, G20 and G7. And this year I am co-chair of the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group and head of the Italian delegation. At national level, I coordinate a national coordination mechanism including more than 20 institutional bodies. And this national coordination mechanism has been acknowledged as a best practice in the ANCAC second review cycle report on Italy, also for its capacity to dialogue and cooperate with the civil society and the private sector. Let me also mention an innovative project that we launched at the Foreign Ministry, the Italian Business Integrity Days, to accompany major industrial groups to present their compliance programs abroad. We are partnering with the civil society on this project and also in the framework of the Milan-based Fondazione Premio Giorgio Ambrosoli, as well as with the Italian chapter of Transparency International. We are particularly proud that some issues and themes proposed by Italy have become part of the global anti-corruption agenda, and I would like to refer to the links between corruption and organized crime, measurement of corruption, and corruption and sport. Thank you.
Thank you, Alfredo. Can I request Professor Alina PPD, who is a professor at Hertie School of Governance, to introduce herself and also let us know why corruption matters to her.
So hello, everybody, and great honor for me to join this panel. I am directly and personally interested in corruption. I am a professor in Berlin, but I am Romanian by birth. And I am one of the many people who studied abroad in a very good university. I returned from Harvard in 1995 to create Romania's first public policy institute after the fall of the Ceausescu dictatorship, only to discover that basically no public policy was possible in absolutely any area unless we manage to remove fundamental state capture and systematic corruption. And I have then become for nearly 15 years in one capacity or another, the civil society leader of a lot of anti-corruption coalitions, which achieved step by step to whatever was achieved until today. But I also realized during all this interval that it was a formidable knowledge gap, that very few serious scholars and scientists were studying corruption. And this is why I also decided that I will prove that this can be studied scientifically in order to counter the effect in corruption, and in particular, the effect which drove me to Berlin, which is that we have a very high correlation presently between corruption in a country and brain drain. In other words, people who believed in merit-based societies flee from corrupt societies to go to merit-based societies. And this really creates a vicious circle for their country of origin, which I think we should try to address better.
Thank you, Professor PPD. Can I now ask Ronan Lorien from UNODC to introduce himself and let us know why corruption matters to him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pant, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this very distinguished panel. So maybe a short background note is that I work for the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. For those who are unfamiliar, it's about 2,500 people. We're based in about 100 physical locations around the world, and we primarily work with criminal justice, crime prevention and criminal justice authorities to implement mandates linked to the drug control conventions, but also tackling organised crime, terrorism, and corruption. Corruption, what I do, it's I currently run the UNODC's program on safeguarding sport from corruption and crime. Relatively new program, but a lot of interest in this whole area, and I think it kind of feeds into sort of that question you asked about why are we working in this area. I mean, sport because of its impact economically. Some estimates at about see its contribution to global economy at about 450 billion per year, rising to about 750 billion per year, depending on its on if the different services that link into that, but also its impact on society, and it's as a driver for engagement, value-driven promotion of values, but also sort of the overall positive impact. So essentially, my day-to-day is working on tackling corruption. So of course, that's going to be sort of the main driver for me. But just to give you a brief sense of what I'm doing and where I'm working.
Thank you, Ronan. Now I'd like to ask our last panelist, Ian Tennant, to also from Global Initiative to introduce himself and also talk about why corruption matters to him.
Thank you very much, Sanjita. I work for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. We're an international civil society organisation based in Geneva, but with locations around the world. We have over 65 members of staff now, and we're made up of a network of experts of over 500 people. I'm based in Vienna, where I run our Resilience Fund against organised crime, which supports civil society organisations. And I also liaise with Ronan and his colleagues over at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime as well. I think for me and for the Global Initiative, it goes back to the original reason why the Global Initiative was created in 2013, which was from a recognition from our founders that more than a law enforcement response is required to tackle organised crime. You need to look at the wider socioeconomic and developmental issues as well. And I think corruption is very much a part of that. So it's important to us because we are looking to see a more coordinated and holistic response to both corruption and organised crime, which are very much interlinked themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Now I would like Alfredo, as a co-chair of the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group, to set out the priorities for G20 in 2021. You have 10 minutes to provide the overview, Alfredo.
Thank you, Sanjita. I would like to start by acknowledging that Italy has really a great contribution to offer to anti-corruption policies at global level, since we have been chosen as co-chair this year at the eve of our G20 presidency. Of course, we should recognize that anti-corruption has been so far a distinctive feature of efficient multilateralism. Thanks to its experience in harmonizing common standards among national legal frameworks, the G20, through the Anti-Corruption Working Group, which was launched 10 years ago, at the Toronto Summit, continues to be well placed to address ongoing and emerging challenges to integrity, transparency, and accountability in the global fight against corruption, especially in the unprecedented global fragility caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. We see heightened risks that corruption may aggravate its adverse effects across the board and undermine efforts towards resilient and sustainable recovery. The Italian presidency next year, of course, will have to, along with the further implementation of previous commitments of the G20, we will work closely with the members to develop and agree a new action plan covering the time span from 2022 to 2024, setting emerging priorities and advancing on key existing tools and work streams. And such endeavor, in my opinion, is very relevant also in view of the first United Nations General Assembly special session on corruption, which is currently scheduled for the beginning of June. And we would like that the G20, in view of this important meeting, be able to ensure a strong momentum on combating corruption at times when corruption risks are more widespread. And from this viewpoint, the cooperation between the member countries and the international organizations, first and foremost UNODC, and the multi-stakeholder approach, so the cooperation with the engagement groups, will add value to our common action. In terms of program of the presidency, setting priorities and deliverables, the basic idea we start from is the need to have a deeper knowledge of corruption. We believe that corruption nowadays thrives along new avenues and takes new forms. Corruption is different from 20 years ago when the Merida Convention was negotiated and approved. We experience forms of fluid corruption involving several parts of the economy, of the society. And for that reason, we believe that the international community should better capture fluid corruption and multiple dimensions and socioeconomic impact. How to do that? First of all, we need to develop more reliable and objective measures in order to fine-tune anti-corruption policies and assess their effectiveness. Italy has proposed this issue since 2017. We hosted in Rome an important workshop on corruption measurement, and we tabled an innovative resolution at the UNCAC, the Conference of the States Parties of the UNCAC, last year in Abu Dhabi, on corruption measurement. We would like that the G20 may bring forward the search for more sound and evidence-based parameters and indicators so as to grasp a granular knowledge of the spread of corruption, which will better inform and refine our prevention and repression tools. An outlook on current methodologies ranging from sample surveys of the population, we have had it in Italy, administrative data, so judicial statistics, and findings by the academia may help anchor corruption measurement in the rule of law. So our deliverable, the expected outcome of this work stream, based upon a questionnaire that has been recently launched thanks to the Saudi presidency this year, we would like to collect and analyze national good practices for measuring corruption, to see how G20 countries measure corruption. And second, to adopt a G20 compendium of good practices on corruption measurement to be submitted to leaders in the Rome summit. Second priority. The globalized economy has exposed, as I was saying at the outset, new and sophisticated avenues of corruption, more and more linked to other economic crimes. Corruption often enables the infiltration of organized crime in the economy and in the public sector. For that reason, we believe that the G20 should raise awareness on emerging threats and provide political guidance to a new era of strengthened and coordinated law enforcement. From this point of view, the expected outcome is to promote a holistic vision of corruption as enabler of other crimes, especially economic crimes. And we aim at adopting a policy document by the G20 on the links between corruption and organized crime. Third, corruption and sport. In the past, the G20 has addressed other risk areas. I may recall customs, wildlife, infrastructures, where good practices and standards have been defined. We believe that sport is now has become more exposed to corruption risks than other sectors traditionally in the spotlight. In sport, we have manifold threats from corruption and fraud on the field, off the field. We know that sport has a very important societal and economic value, and that's why we should act to protect sport from any corruption and malfeasance. The German presidency in 2017 proposed a focus on this matter. We would like to go further and would like to bring the G20 to agree on, a policy document, probably in the form of high-level principles to commit to safeguard sport from corruption. And another objective will be the reflection and possible policy response of what the crisis has brought to our attention in terms of keeping high the standards of integrity and transparency. The G20 before, in 2014, adopted the high-level principles on corruption and growth, highlighting the normal, let's say, negative impact of corruption on economic growth. Now we have faced a terrible crisis with the COVID-19. We would like to focus on what means anti-corruption in times of crisis. How we better shield the economy and society from corruption risks in the emergency. These emergencies may be local or regional in scope. We have seen that in the past, relevant amounts of emergency funds, emergency response funding has been lost to corruption. The pandemic outbreak hits all economies globally. And so we would like to nurture our response to address corrupt behaviors, modalities and consequences during crisis, and also to be better prepared, to develop our preparedness in case of future emergencies. In the framework of the consequences of COVID-19 pandemic on corruption, we would like to keep a focus on healthcare, of course. Healthcare is an important risk area. We have worked in Italy with the civil society, with Transparency International on this issue. And we know that conflicts of interest may arise around contracts and funding for research on vaccines, clinical trial pharmaceuticals for human use. So this may be an area where the G20 should say a word. And we do not forget the private sector. We are thinking to assess also the implementation from G20 countries on previous commitments, namely concerning the beneficial ownership, transparency, liability of legal persons, and the private sector integrity. We have several instruments that were adopted in the past, and we would like to focus on the implementation of these instruments, because in these areas have systemic implications for the fight against corruption, including its emerging forms. I refer to the involvement of legal professions, of accountants, of other professional figures that may be instrumental to criminal groups or to corrupt conducts. I'm grateful for this today's opportunity to give some hints on the Italian presidency program in anti-corruption, and we have discussed with other non-governmental stakeholders, of course, with the C20 in this very important and solemn framework of the C20 summit. We are also discussing with the Open Government Partnership, with the Open Contracting Partnership. We are receiving a lot of proposals to the Italian presidency. And so I'm really grateful for this opportunity today, and I'm ready to continue the discussion later on. Thank you, Sanjita.
Thank you, Alfredo. Thank you very much for the very detailed overview. I think this has been really helpful, especially for our experts who are working on the specific areas you've mentioned on measurement of corruption, organized crime, as well as corruption in sports. So moving on, I would like to ask Professor PPD, having worked in this, being an expert in measuring corruption, I would like Professor PPD to give her initial thoughts on the G20's priorities on measuring corruption, as well as examples of any tools or technology that the G20 could use to measure corruption.
So hello again, everybody, and thank you, Alfredo, for this great introduction. I think, yes, it is a very, very good priority for the Italian presidency to promote new corruption measurements. In particular, since I think that there have been quite a lot of advances on corruption measurement in the academia. I think we should all realize that, in fact, although it would really be great if countries would support control of corruption, Nevertheless, it is independent academics or think tanks or organizations such as Transparency International or Open Budget Index, which have developed most of the corruption measurements. And I am aware of a number of interesting corruption measurements, like Lucio Picci's from Bologna Administrative Corruption Act, which have only been measured once simply because they never had financial support to do this a second time, although it is a measurement not based on perception, but a fact-based, very good quality measurement. So I hope everybody can see my slides by now. So what I mean to say very briefly is just to show you that there have really been significant steps ahead in creating actionable measurements of corruption. Important thing is that to understand that in order to measure corruption or actually organized crime, what we need to do is to define it clearly. That's all we need to do. And there is not one definition of corruption. You know, corruption is like a framework, a generic word. Corruption in financial markets is very, very much different than, petty administrative corruption. And therefore, we can measure both of them, and we can measure them and we can compare them across countries as long as we define very well, first, what is the area or the sector that we look at, and second, what is the normal, what is the normal benchmark, how should things actually function in that sector in the absence of corruption. And then we can definitely measure the distance between what it should be and what is. This is how most policy analyses work. Another thing which by now we have enough evidence of is to understand that de facto and de jure do not correlate very well in anti-corruption and rule of law. In other words, if you know how a judiciary is organized, this will not predict if that judiciary is independent or not. If you know how thick anti-corruption regulation of a country is, this will not predict if the country manages to control corruption or not. And therefore, we need like separate measurements and always be aware and calculate the test, as we say, the relationship between these two. Finally, I think that perception indicators, which had the great merit of raising awareness to the problem of corruption, are completely change insensitive. So we need some fact-based measurements, because otherwise we do not understand if anti-corruption policies have any impact. But fact-based measurements can actually measure impact fairly clearly from one year to another. So what kind of measurements have been, meanwhile, developed? I would say that we have new measurements, actionable measurements, because that is the main target, measurements on the basis of which we can act. We have actionable measurements at country level and at sector level, at various sectors, actually. And one measurement, for instance, at country level are these measurements based on procurement, which are becoming more and more popular, and in fact more and more easy to do as countries become very seriously digitalized. I hope you can see now my measurement on procurement, more or less. So what we have is, for instance, we can predict both at contract level and both by agency level, so to enable administrative action against contracting authorities in procurement, to calculate fairly closely the corruption risk by contract and by agency. We can calculate agency capture, in other words, how much an agency is captured by private interest, and we can calculate red flags and degree of competitiveness of procurement, and we can actually put these corruption risks very well in relation to value for money. You can see some examples on our platform, opentender.eu, where you will also find 47 million contracts with risk indicators, and you can search in 35 countries by contracting agency, by company, or by the sector that you're interested in. What you see in the upper hand side of the graph is at contract level. You see contracts in red, which are contracts where aggregated risk flags pass the threshold of risks, and the contracts in green, which are the contracts relatively free of risk and with good value for money. And on the bigger graph, you see some of the risk indicators, the single bidding, the risky procedure, the too short advertising, and too short decision. And this can be, these procurement-based indicators you can do across national funds, across aid funds, and across any kind of sector, and it will indicate you fairly well what happens in the sector. And also you can set targets from one year to another. You can say, okay, we have 70% agency capture. Contracting authorities just give to one private bidder all their money to buy from toilet paper to nuclear rackets. But next year, the target is 50%, or whoever is in charge of these tenders goes, leaves the agency, and another person who's able to bring this closer to good targets comes. So fairly actionable and easy to do. At national level, we have developed several indicators which now exist for 120 countries and more, like Integrity Index Org, which is based on a simple model. Model argues that control of corruption is the result between resources, like administrative discretion, proxied by red tape, and by material resources, proxied by fiscal transparency. Material resources are, the resource curse, the proceeds from natural resources, but also other things, other money which can be used discretionarily, like money from aid or all kind of high-risk infrastructure allocations, money which basically can be turned easily to corruption purposes. And we can definitely document this. At the level of constraints, which should supposed to be balanced, we have an autonomous judiciary, a free press, and civil society proxied as e-citizens. Number of people who have internet household connections and are linked through social media in order to enable collective action. If I know this e-citizens indicator, I can predict the corruption level in 2/3 of the 200 countries that we have presently. So it's a very powerful indicator. If you go on the webpage, countries will be displayed in comparison with their region, in comparison with their income group. So, we're not going to compare Rwanda with Denmark, but we're going to compare Rwanda with its neighbors. And therefore, in the 6 areas of the index, which are all fact-based measurements, you can very well see where a country is trailing behind its neighbors and what should a country do. Also, you can answer quite important research questions, which are like, why didn't the world evolve at all in the past 10, 15 years in any indicator, despite this unprecedented investment in anti-corruption? And the answer is because one important causal component of control of corruption, freedom of the press, has only been going down. So despite the fact that we have been piling up regulations and new conditionalities, when you have what are the major causes of control of corruption actually regressing, there is no way that we can record any progress. Now we can, of course, for people who invest into giving countries good legislation, we have developed tools by which we can actually test if this legislation works, and in particular, what contexts enable regulation against corruption. And this is the 35-based webpage, Europam, which we developed as an offshoot of the old World Bank public accountability mechanism, which is no longer working now. But we have developed this in more advanced form so that basically it comes out quantified. So the thicker the regulation, the bigger a score the country comes. And if you're interested in one specific element of the regulation, you can use the web page and display maps of these 35 countries, see who does what. And countries appears as you see them here in these 6 public accountability tools. And you can also, answer important policy questions here. Now you can see immediately, the big discussion in Europe that Hungary is a bad country where, there are authoritarian steps ahead, democratic backsliding, corruption proven by Olaf, the European regulator, and the rest. But if you look and compare Finland, which is on top of Europe and the world, with Hungary, you will discover that Hungary has so much thicker regulation than Finland. Hungary actually does better of nearly everything than Finland. It's only one thing which Finland does better, and this is transparency. So you can see that in fact, the whole equilibrium, the whole good balance of Finland is achieved by transparency. So pressing more and more regulations on Hungary is not going to solve the problem. It's probably other kind of solutions that will work, but those are not, that Hungary should change laws or adopt more laws, because they already have far more laws than the best regulated countries in the world. Just an example how Europam looks. Let's say you're interested if beneficial owners can, in fact, place bids for public contracts. You go to Europam and you are able to generate this and see that, in fact, in Europe, we still have a minority of countries which forbid offshores and other companies with dubious ownership from in fact, running for public money. Now, on sector level, I mean, in order to come closer to the civil society work, we also thought that, there are another important research question is why so many transparency means have been adopted in the past 15 years, and nevertheless, countries like Ukraine, which now has the best public procurement portal in the world, the ProZorro, the most transparent and everything, it's still a very corrupt country, and Ukrainians complain and they say, oh, we are the most corrupt, transparent country which exists. And the reason why this happens, but we argue, is that in fact, it's been a lot of investment and conditionality related to de jure transparency and very little related to de facto transparency, to information and portals out there providing people the information to fight corruption themselves by simply defending their interests. Because successful anti-corruption actually, in the end of the day, has to be based on people's interest. It's not something that can come from just top down or from just a few altruistic activists. And therefore, we have documented for 120 countries a new index. This is still in the work, where we simply looked, on one hand, we looked at what treaties countries adopted, and you can see this in the de jure index in the right-hand side. And if you want to recommend us more treaties which involve transparency that countries adopted, like the IPI, you see that we've put UNCAC there, OGP, all the usual things. But, there may be more ideas. We're open to them because this is in the making. Also, the de jure index is very easy to do. And then we also had a de facto index, which is far more complicated to do, where we actually checked if websites needed for control of corruption exist in every country, like a searchable register of commerce, a searchable land register, which are digital, which are accessible so that people, can defend themselves from fraud and corruption. Like, is the national auditor in a country even publishing its annual report where he says how many corruption irregularities he found so that public opinion, civil society can act on it? Now, you will not be surprised that the de facto and de jure, although we are not ready and still make checks, we have done like a first rendering of the data. They do not correlate with one another, right? So countries with the deepest transparency are not necessarily the countries with adopted more treaties. And I think that here is where the civil society work should actually go. Civil society work should focus on the de facto transparency, and also conditionality should be tied more in the future to the de facto transparency. Finally, a little bit about the future. Since we receive a lot of questions about the future, most indicators predict the past, we have done a little bit of guesswork here, but as scientific as it can get. We looked at 10-year trends in the Index for Public Integrity, in other words, in statistically proven components which explain corruption. Then we have weighted these 10-year trends because we do not want to predict the future just based on the past, right? Although it is important if a country has been progressing, let's say, on e-government or have been regressing on freedom of the press. We are weighting this by recent political contingencies. Let's say, Slovakia elected a pure anti-corruption president. I mean, this has to be weighted somehow, regardless of the trends. So we looked at this, if this is consistent with the 10 years trend. And then we weighted a second time by like the permanent demand for good governance, which is proxied by the e-citizens, basically by the number of people that you have who are economically and politically autonomous and digitally empowered to defend themselves, to be critical citizens, to demand good governance from governance. And putting all these three together, we have generated this map where you can click at every country. You can find the 10 years data, so to understand where a country has been going and why a country is where it is now. Most of these indicators correlate among themselves. So our fact-based indicators correlate fairly well with perception indicators, with some exceptions. I'm not going to name them, but there are some notorious exceptions, the ones that are verified by the World Bank presently for doing business, for instance. Okay, there are a number of outlier countries which invested a lot into looking good in charts. So we also have corruption of indicators, but we are aware and we are checking this. And this will display country by country, and then you can go and see what a country is doing wrong, what could they do, in fact, to redress the balance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor PPD. This has been really useful, I'm sure, for the co-chair and the rest of the participants and experts in the panel as well. Now, moving on to the next speaker, I would like to request Ian, who has been working on the organized crime area, and given that this is a priority for the G20, to provide some thoughts on this topic, as well as probably talk about specific areas within organized crime that the G20 should be considering this year. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk a bit about the G20, obviously, the G20's priorities, its action plans, and how that relates to organized crime. But also, I want to take a step back and look at the multilateral system more generally. So, looking at the high-level principles of the G20, from the 7 principles, organized crime is mentioned once. And looking at the 2019-2021 action plan, organized crime is also mentioned only once as well. And I say that just to demonstrate that although there is a recognition of the links between organized crime and corruption in these G20 processes, I think we would like to see a deeper understanding of the links between organized crime and corruption. I just want to talk a little bit about that relationship. So we can say that corruption and organized crime have a symbiotic relationship. And what we mean by that is they're mutually reinforcing. What I'm saying here on this slide is corruption offers the means to allow illicit markets to operate. And conversely, the power, influence, and wealth of organized crime puts those criminal actors in a powerful position to control the political economy. More practically speaking, what does that mean? And on the slide here, I've got a quote from Guinea-Bissau for an organization that we're working with who are studying tracking organized crime there. And they say drug traffickers support politicians on the understanding that if they win, they will leave the traffickers alone. And politicians also need a way to launder their money. So the links with organized crime are useful. I mean, that's a specific context from one country, but I think we can all recognize how that would play out in different countries that maybe we have experience in, but it's a familiar picture. But what's important about this is not just recognizing that those links exist, it's recognizing that these both organized crime and corruption have real effects on society and harms on society, and understanding what they are. I mean, I think it's a relatively well-rehearsed list of things we can see on the screen here that we talk about in terms of corruption, organized crime, and how they damage society, hold back development, undermine the rule of law, and democracy. But it's also important to recognize the violence and the death that we see at the hands of organized crime and corruption. I mean, you can see here, previous speaker was talking about Slovakia. On the screen here, you can see the face of Jan Kuciak, the Slovakian journalist that was murdered last year as he was investigating the links between organized crime, business and politics in his country. And as the Global Initiative, we've been documenting some of these cases, which is where these pictures come from, our Assassinations Witness book and campaign. For us as a civil society organization, obviously, we see that civil society bears the brunt of organized crime and corruption. And when organized crime, politics and business are well coordinated, the effects are most damaging. So what we want to see is the international response being as coordinated as they are. I want to talk a little bit here about another reason why tackling these issues together is important. Organized crime, by its nature, operates behind the scenes. use of money, threats, protection to control people, whether at the community level or at the high-level political level. Corruption can be tackled in a number of ways, and the G20 action plan is actually very comprehensive in the number of issues that it looks at in terms of financial crime, transparency, and everything else. But I think there is a slight danger when you focus on corruption. We know that some political leaders in various countries are very keen to use corruption to attack the previous regime or the potential future regime. And, while this may look like big wins against corruption, taking out one or two high-level targets through this investigation doesn't dismantle the complex criminal networks and tackle the underlying problems, which is why we need a more holistic approach and recognition through the G20 and through the multilateral system more generally. And as I say, whether it's the G20 or whether it's the plethora of other international instruments that we have, I don't think the problem is that there is a lack of recognition. I mean, this is from the foreword to the UN Convention Against Corruption, Kofi Annan. What he says here is very clear about the links between all of these things and how insidious corruption is. But I think, looking at this page, you can see, some of the international organizations that are working on this, aside from the G20, UNCAC, the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, and that's the Security Council at the bottom as well. And I think, again, the issue is not that there is a lack of understanding of the importance or a lack of forums for this to be discussed, is that there isn't an overarching vision or forum to bring this all together. We did some research recently which showed that out of the UN's 102 entities, 79 of them, which is 77%, have a working agenda related to organized crime. And we've also seen that organized crime is being increasingly recognized as a security threat by the Security Council. But again, we don't see much coordination. So we think the G20 is well placed to input primarily into the big meetings that are coming up during the presidency. So Alfredo already mentioned the UN General Assembly Special Session on Corruption, which happens in 2021. And we also have the Crime Congress, which is every 5 years Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, which looks at the wide range of UN crime issues. And that was supposed to be meeting in 2020, is actually going to be meeting in 2021. And I think it's an opportunity for the G20 to work through both of these processes to promote a more cohesive and unified response, both recognizing the links between organized crime and corruption and linking up the responses to them. And just to go through a couple of other issues before I finish, I was asked to comment on the effects of the pandemic on organized crime and corruption. You can see on here a publication that we published earlier in the year looking at the impact of pandemic and organized crime, and what we can see through this publication, through the ongoing research that we've done, is clearly the pandemic offers challenges and opportunities. I mean, there's challenges in terms of some disruption to the ability to get things, illicit goods to market, but also we know that organized crime, it adapts and it likes to take advantage of crises. Whether it was prohibition in America in the early 20th century, we know how they like to take advantage of crises and innovate to do so. And Alfredo mentioned some of the impacts on healthcare, on funds being made available to respond to COVID, and how corruption has already capitalized on that. We also see an impact in terms of state responses to the pandemic as well, where heavy-handed approaches to lockdown restrictions in some countries further diminishes trust in law enforcement institutions, and where gangs or other organized crime groups step in to either hand out food, hand out aid, or look after the kind of enforce the lockdown restrictions themselves as well. But overall, it's a long-term issue, and the pandemic's effects on socioeconomic issues, poverty, development will be felt for many years to come, and those are the underlying issues that create fertile ground for organised crime. So, yeah, as I say, just to finish off with a few recommendations, the G20 is well placed to lead efforts as a forum of the 20 biggest economies, and we're very pleased that the Italian presidency next year will make organised crime a priority under the anti-corruption strand. We would call for to really foster some of this coordination, a joint high-level meeting of all the relevant UN and other international bodies with organised crime and corruption mandates to start the process of coordination. We would call for the G20 to have a specific track looking at the UNGAS 2021 and the Crime Congress to influence the outcomes of those, both those bodies, including a commitment to integrate and coordinate across the multilateral system in terms of its follow-up. And finally, we see civil society as a part of society which is affected very at the coalface of organised crime and corruption, but also a part of society that has a lot of data and insights into what's going on. So we're very keen to see civil society continuing through this forum or through other forums feeding into these, the G20 and the wider multilateral system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian, for your presentation and very useful insight in organized crime and the recommendations for the G20. I would like to now move on to ask Ronan to provide similar views, given that corruption in sports is the third priority for the G20 in 2021, and also briefly talk about what specific areas within corruption in sports that the G20 should be prioritizing and looking into.
All right, thanks very much, Sanjita, and thanks to the speakers who went before me. Very interesting, just really very interesting to listen from you, and how it actually made me think a little bit more about my own area of work. But maybe just to jump straight in, maybe if I could just start with a brief context setting of COVID and how it impacts on sport. And this feeds into what Alfredo was talking about, the idea of how do you do anti-corruption in a time of crisis? So in the context of sport, just to touch on that briefly, before maybe looking at the outcome that the G20 could look to try and generate when it comes to tackling corruption in sport, and then focusing on maybe 3 key outputs that they could really work on to try and get to that outcome. So the first is the whole COVID context, and I think Elena, you spoke really interesting overviews, but in particular that idea to look at something from a sectoral point of view, and I think from sports point of view, in the context of COVID, how is that sector being affected by the crisis? And what does that mean from an anti-corruption perspective? So I think, first of all, if we look before the crisis, the pandemic hit, the old normal, we talk about the old normal, then the new normal, but the old normal when it came to anti-corruption, when it came to corruption in sport, we're talking about specific threats which are relatively unique. So doping, match fixing, illegal betting, so unique to sport, and very particular to sport would be that whole, the organization of a major sports event, which is not unique to sport, but nevertheless really one of the main drivers of its, certainly promoting its impact on society. But married to that, you also had the typical sectoral problems of bribery, conflicts of interests, general procurement risks. So these are kind of things that like overlap or are common to many different sectors. But now with the pandemic, this new normal, I think what we're seeing in particular is that you're seeing sports organizations going to a kind of a survival mode, where actually, the risks of corruption, the risks actually of organized crime coming in and taking advantage of that situation to exploit players, clubs, referees, officials, to try and manipulate it, to capture it in effect, are heightened. And in that unique context now, I think it's important to think in particular about detection mechanisms and reporting mechanisms and this idea of transparency, really highlighting what's going on. So maybe just to set it in that context, that pandemic, the kind of risks that are facing sport, and then to move on to what the G20 could look at in particular. And I think, essentially what we're thinking about here is like looking forward to the future. And again, Alina spoke about this, what trends can you see in the future? I mean, we all want our crystal ball, but it's key that if you want sport to thrive and prosper, it has to be credible, right? So it has to be something that you can believe in. And I think that idea of, having the integrity of sport, strengthening the integrity of sport so that it emerges from this whole pandemic as strong as possible is kind of like an investment in its future. So I think that sort of the key message there is essentially that we need to put the G20 could look to strengthen the integrity of sport to help it emerge from this crisis as strong as possible. Okay, that's all well and good to say that, but in practice, what could we focus on? So I just listed 3 points. I really could go on, but I think the first one, though, is maybe looking in particular at ensuring that regulations, ensuring the legislation exists, and if it's not should be, we should try and understand how better to use legislation that exists for a sport context. So what do I mean by that? So some of the specific problems in sport, like match fixing, many governments in the world, they don't know what to do about it because, number one, they don't have legislation to address it. I think it's worth pointing out that the match fixing issue, it's something that in the sports world is seen as on a par as being as bad as doping. I mean, just if you park that for a second, even from a philosophical point of view, at least when you're doping, you're cheating to win, when you're match fixing, you're cheating to lose. So it's even worse in the sorts of, in that type of sense. But that's all to talk about something really quite negative. And so, first of all, from a legislative point of view, do you need specific legislation to tackle those type of problems? If so, what could that look like? But if you don't, then I think it's important. And I think the G20 here, with the type of expertise that they have, can also add to that discussion about saying, well, actually, this is what we have done. These are examples of how we have used legislation to tackle these type of unique crimes in sport or unique problems in sport. So essentially there, to go back to the first point about what an output would be for the G20 to look to strengthen and enhance legislation or regulation and how it's implemented de facto in terms of tackling corruption in sport. The second point, and this is more, I think this feeds into what Ian was saying, the sort of coordination issue. What we're seeing is we want to try, at least the UNODC, but we're also getting this is coming from sport itself. So of course sports face all these different scandals, and like you've got the International Olympic Committee, you've got FIFA, and all the different issues that have affected how those organizations have been undermined by corruption in recent years. But what we're also seeing is that essentially they're saying, well, our job is to implement our rules. Our job, we don't really know how to tackle, the corruptors, and we need governments to step into that space. However, they have a lot of information there that can help. They are the ones who, if they want to be proactive and to take those steps forward, there need to be mechanisms in place so that sport and government officials tackling corruption and crime can liaise, exchange, and coordinate. And this is maybe a more concrete idea. I mean, from the G20 perspective, what we're seeing is that, okay, let's say in a unique sports sense, going back in the past, you had the problem of doping, right? But you didn't have any mechanisms to create it to exist that existed to tackle that problem. So they created the World Anti-Doping Agency. However, as Ian rightly pointed out, you have all these different mechanisms and frameworks that already exist, and you have these different initiatives. But how can we look to coordinate them so that you can actually go, you can work with sports organizations to tackle problems? This is something, for example, quite particularly that FIFA said. We just signed an MOU with FIFA a couple of weeks ago, and it came to Vienna, the president of FIFA, and he said, look, we see these problems on the ground in these various countries that we work in. We see wrongdoing in general, including corruption and crime, but also sexual abuse, all these type of issues. But we're not seeing investigations. We're not seeing proper police work or detection happening. So how can the G20 look to coordinate that or to promote efforts that are designed to tackle these problems? And there, for example, we have the International Partnership Against Corruption in Sport. Maybe that could be a vehicle that exists. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. It could be something to look at, directed. Equally put, we have these other UN agencies that could be supported. So that idea of like developing more effective coordination mechanisms for sport to tackle these sort of unique problems, but also, they're not always unique, but to help tackle those issues in general. And then finally, and I'll finish up there, is just a third output potentially for the G20 to look to support or push forward is to try and develop and support the detection and reporting mechanisms on corruption in sport. So this goes back to the point I was saying earlier about, we see these risks now. You see sports in survival mode, and actually lots of government aid is going to sport to prop it up. But you want to make sure that this is going to the right purposes, that's being used by sports clubs to maintain its positions, to keep some of the salaries going of players, so they're not, undermined and looked maybe to get involved in match fixing, for example. And so making sure that we have these detection or giving more prominence to detection and reporting, this transparency that Alina also mentioned that was so key. That transparency angle for sports clubs, the sports sector in general, to sort of showcase what they're doing, because you hear that it's not always a priority for them, and it'd be a shame that if they survive, if there's the survival mode aspect, that they throw out this idea of integrity just to survive. I think it's something that the G20 could perhaps look to try and anchor more, or trying to push that question about integrity more into the center of the debate about corruption in sport. I could go on, but maybe I'll just leave it there with those points. Of course, happy to follow up if needed.
Thank you, Ronan. Thank you again for your feedback and ideas as well. I think it'll be really useful to get a view from Alfredo, given that all the three experts have expressed their views on and provided feedback and ideas to see what resonated with Alfredo as a G20 co-chair for Anti-Corruption Working Group. Alfredo, any feedback from your side on what all the experts have said?
Yes.
Maybe just quickly in 2 or 3 minutes.
Yes.
That'd be useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we are particularly interested in all your considerations and recommendations, since Italy has highlighted measurement issue and links with the organized crime issue and sport integrity at the core of anti-corruption agenda. Also in other fora, we have promoted ANCAC resolutions, as I was saying before. Regarding the presentation made by Alina, of course, is very interesting to put together, to combine de jure and de facto indicators. I have a reservation on the way you assess the standard of independence of the judiciary. And we have discussed this before, also in Rome, when we met in the foreign ministry at the Luis University, and you know that we have a very different thinking on that. Thank you to Ian for his insightful assessment on corruption and organized crime. We are very much interested in working with GTOC and other non-governmental actors on this issue. On sport and corruption, about what Ronan was saying, we believe that now we should sustain and promote cooperation between sport bodies. We have private sector governance model, sport bodies on one side, and also the international federations and law enforcement authorities. There is a lot to do in this perspective.
Thank you. We have, I think we have already gotten into the participant. We're ready to get questions from the participants. And we've received one about, and this one is, I think maybe Ian could answer this. And also Alina might, Professor PPD might have some thoughts on this as well. The question is, the G20 is a very top-down process inherently. How can we best support bottom-up solutions to these issues too, and connect those to the larger policy initiatives? Alina mentioned CSOs pushing for de facto transparency, and Ian runs a resilience fund that supports CSOs. What kinds of supports to bottom-up efforts to fight corruption really work? So maybe Professor PPD could go first, and then Ian could follow.
Well, thank you very much for these questions and the comments. So first, I think, for Jan, I think the question is very simple. He directly funds civil society organizations, so he can help civil society organizations by funding them. What I think, I think other things which are coming up. I mean, for instance, ideas of things, very concrete, down-to-earth things to do. I mean, Alfredo and me actually share our, let me put it like this, belief that the judicial independence measurement that we use is suboptimal. In fact, from all the measurements that I have shown, this component is the only one which is not fact-based. It's based on an expert survey as calculated by World Economic Forum in the Global Competitiveness Report. And we know this is not perfect. But why has not any government, including the richest governments so far, sponsored a measure of de facto judicial independence? Because I told you that de facto judicial independence is not based on the organization of the judiciary. We have evidence on this. But nevertheless, this does not mean that there are not objective ways of assessing it, that there are not judicial statistics by which we could assess if a judiciary is both non-corrupt and independent from government and effective. So we can definitely put together a measurement like this. The only reason why we all have to use, everybody, even the European Commission has to use this judicial independence indicator that we use as a component is as nothing else exists. And this is tedious to do. And I like to answer our civil society colleagues and say that, we each have to do our bit. What we do at againstcorruption.eu, which is my website, is that we create all these repositories and techniques to measure corruption and techniques to assess if your anti-corruption strategy is right and to correct it for free use. You can go in, you can log, and you have like your own anti-corruption advisor, which is entirely free. And we will continue to produce this, produce this on our research funds, which have to exist to do something quality. But then we create these huge repositories for 100 and something countries where you don't need to calculate your corruption risk. I will put there an app to calculate your corruption risk in procurement for you. And if your country is not included, what you can do if the country has free data is simply to put your data into a similar format, and it will work for you. And finally, I think that, if G20 countries give an example from their own countries on how this should work, because this last generation of measurement is very close to evaluation of government, and it's very close to measures of digitalization and of transparency. So if a developed country government will simply introduce this kind of evaluation measurement, let's take a utility like water, for instance, you need to use this public service from water, from when you put water for the first time, when you pay it, when you ask for service. If each time you would have an app on your smartphone by which you will evaluate how did this work? Did it work as it should, or actually did it work? You needed to know somebody at utilities to work for you, or you needed to pay a bribe. And not by a survey, not by a sample, but by everybody. Everybody will get, once you get your subscription to water, you will get the app to evaluate water. And this is how, evaluation and measurement come together and at the same time create a super actionable measurement, because if you have too many negative evaluations, you're going to be changed as manager of whatever service you have of water. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor PPD. Ian, maybe you could also share your thoughts on this.
Sure. I think the first thing to say when it comes to which kind of bottom-up approaches work, I think one thing that we've that's at the centre of our work is to make sure that approaches are appropriate to the local context and tailored to the local context, and that's what it's all about. And I'd like to highlight one particularly interesting example of bottom-up kind of community-based approach, and that's actually from Italy, the Addio Pizzo campaign, which was against the pizzo, so the extortion protection payment in I believe it was in Sicily, and this community organization got together and started the campaign to stop people paying it, and that kind of bottom-up approach really worked. And we've actually worked with this organization to train community activists in Latin America to export that approach there. And I think the other thing to say is that it's very different. For example, we work a lot in the Western Balkans, where there's quite a highly developed body of civil society and academia and researchers working on organized crime and corruption issues. So we see kind of the way that they can be supported is by connecting them together and giving them access to capacity building platforms for collaboration, etc. But then if you go to somewhere else where we work, for example, I mentioned Guinea-Bissau earlier, we find there that there might not be a lot of organizations, that think that they're experts on organized crime, but actually they start out as human rights NGOs or anti-corruption NGOs, and they realize that they're spending a lot of their time gathering information on organized crime. So it's helping. The way you can help these kind of organizations is helping them join the dots, capacity building, platform building, so that they can, do their work in a sustainable way as possible.
Thank you. We have another question, and this is regarding the coordination of various international bodies working on these issues. And I think this has been brought up by Ian as well as Ronan. Can I request Ronan to try and answer this? The question is, so how do we actually get the coordination working in practice? So how do we meaningfully align timeframes, incentives, and processes? Any thoughts on that? I know you've touched on the need for that, but are there any specific practical examples or suggestions you'd like to give?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about sort of the initiative that we're currently sort of leading, and we're hoping to roll out a little bit to make it a bit more accessible to more governments and sports organizations. And that's the International Partnership Against Corruption in Sport. And I think what's interesting there is that, I referred earlier to the fact that we had in the sports world, you had the problem of doping. So you had a convention, and then you created an institution with the walls and the secretariat and the budget, and that's the World Anti-Doping Agency. However, the sports movement, by that I mean the movement as led by the International Olympic Committee, looking at the recent scandals that have happened in about 2015, 2016, 2017, said, okay, well, let's look to see how we can leverage the skills, knowledge and abilities of different organizations, governments and sports organizations, and bring them together under a partnership framework rather than an institutional approach. And that's led to this creation of the IPACs. And, it's not without its hiccups, but it's a new platform that we've created. We're about to send out. We had an IPACs 1.0, if I would call it like that, and now we're just going to turn it into IPACs 2.0, where we have much more emphasis on transparency. And one of the key issues here, all around these sort of new initiatives, is also a question about legitimacy. How does it make decisions, and who endorses those decisions, and is it credible? And so what we're trying to do here is really bring together governments who really want to be part of this initiative to tackle corruption in sport in its various guises, and bring together sports organizations as well as intergovernmental organizations. So it's sort of three approaches to try and push sort of this on the agenda, and to try and really get people to bring organizations and to bring their resources to bear to understand the problems and how to address them in specific contexts. So, for example, we're looking at procurement, corruption when it comes to procurement in major sports events, conflicts of interest in major sports, conflicts of interest in sports. Also, good governance. What does that look like in the sports context? And then finally, looking at creating how to develop mechanisms to promote this cooperation between sports organizations and criminal justice authorities. So we created these task forces. We're pushing that ahead. It's a very sort of concrete example of what we're doing. There's many other things that I could highlight, but I think in the context of this conversation on G20, it fits quite neatly into some of the interest areas in particular of this grouping, given, for example, their hosting of major sports events, given that many of them have such a strong sports backbone to their economies, the influence of it, for example, the English Premiership, La Liga, all these very famous, and of course, that's not to forget the Italian football leagues as well. There's many different areas there, but I thought maybe that whole initiative IPACs is an interesting one to see what's being done in practice.
Thank you, Ronan. And I think we have a little over 10 minutes before we finish this session, and I think it'd be really useful to get back again to Alfredo's thought also on the coordination issue, given that there are different multilateral and international bodies that are working on these issues, but how do we coordinate them, and how do we get the process to be more open? I think that would be a useful conversation. I think will be useful for all the participants. And also for Alfredo, if you could, again, what like Ronan, what was asked, what I asked Ronan about aligning timeframes, incentives, and processes. If you could just briefly talk about that. And also the commitments. There's always been an issue about not following up on the commitments. So just a few sentences or examples of how the G20 could do better in terms of monitoring its own commitments in the coming year. Yeah, thank you.
Well, it's very difficult because when we talk about coordination, we have also to take into account the competencies of different bodies. And of course, it is important to break the silos and try to address challenges and threats in a holistic way. We have the sustainable development paradigm, which is a sort of overarching framework, and a lot of actors, governments, international organizations have to coordinate their efforts. Is not easy. It's not easy at all. Let me say that the fight against corruption may be a testing ground for the synergy between governments, international organizations, private sector, civil society, and academia. One of the main challenges or hurdles that we have experienced in the anti-corruption working group is how to better sell and communicate efforts of this group that is providing high-level policy documents, high-level principles, guidelines, compendia. Unfortunately, most of these tools are known only in a restricted circle of authorized personnel and do not express a full potential. So the role of civil society is maybe a keystone in value dissemination, in letting a broader audience to know what the international community is doing and what is the work in progress in the field of anti-corruption. It's a sort of paradox, and I hope that this paradox be healed in future, to let the endeavor of anti-corruption working group be known by a larger portion of recipients, and to understand how we can benefit of the anti-corruption working group work. So we need to improve our communication strategy of technical documents that are endorsed by leaders, and of course to expand the contribution of civil society also within the anti-corruption working group. You know, we have a formula. I'm very much attached to that. We should move from the multi-stakeholder to a multi-shareholder approach, because civil society has a really crucial role to play in effective implementation of anti-corruption policies, well beside what just the government can do. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think I would like to ask one last question to all our three experts, and maybe just in 90 seconds, given that this is the C20 summit and the civil society is working on a lot of these issues. And I think it'll be useful to know a lot of the topics we've talked about. It ultimately sort of comes down to people's participation. So what can people do to participate more on this, to push the agendas that the G20 is working on? Are there tools that they can use, the technology in your specific areas to make their respective governments accountable? Because ultimately it seems like despite the larger forums, it is down to the people and how they engage with their respective governments. So any ideas from the work that you have done just in 90 seconds will be very useful. Thank you. Sorry, could I ask Professor PPD to begin, followed by Ian and then Ronan?
Yes, surely. Okay, so we're not longer speaking about people influencing through advocacy international organizations, because although this is needed, definitely this is not what brings an end to corruption in a country. We're talking about what civil society can do in a country, and my short answer is build very broad alliances. Ally yourselves also with groups which have in their best interest to change the situation. It's no way that a handful of altruists can win this fact. What I see from my historical studies is that each time a country managed to turn the page, to move from systematic corruption to corruption as an exception, it was the result of very broad alliances of altruists with egoists, with people who really needed the change because they stood to lose from the old arrangements. And this should be completely open to unions, to church, to absolutely everyone who wants to join. The more alliances and the more, sector-based and clear issue-based alliances, the more we will have success. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor PPD. Ian, would you like to share your thoughts as well on this in 90 minutes? Sorry, 90 seconds.
I was going to say 90 minutes. It might be a bit of a struggle. But no, I mean, I completely agree with Alina's comments that, forging those local alliances is key. And I think it's important for people, for civil society to remember that organized crime thrives when people are either too scared to say what's happening, or where people aren't paying attention. So gathering evidence, documenting it, and finding those trusted partners and safe ways to disseminate that information, albeit in a shrinking and more dangerous civil society space than ever, is absolutely key.
Thank you. And Ronan, your thoughts are in 90 seconds, please.
Yeah, I think I kind of echo a little bit what Ian and Alina were saying. I think it's certainly that emphasis of contributing, but also at that national, local level, the importance of having academia do their own research and feeling free. Of course, there's many caveats there, but doing their own research to understand a little bit more the dynamic in the local context is key. And that can feed into sort of those general policies and good practices that we can help identify specifically on the topic of corruption, crime in sport. But also the value and from the sports world in particular, of course, there's been a lot of evidence of the importance of whistleblowing, but investigative journalism has been key in uncovering a lot of these topics. And I really would say that that freedom of the press, that holding that as to facilitate journalists to do their work, to come forward and to have the protection needed to do so is important. Many other angles there. 90 seconds, very short, but nevertheless, maybe I'll finish just by saying thank you, Sanjita, for moderating this, and thanks to the panelists for their excellent contributions. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I think this has been a really interesting conversation, and I hope everyone who's joined in has found it useful as well. And I think just touching up on the main points that were raised, I think there is an understanding that on a lot of these issues, it's not a lack of understanding, although in some of the areas maybe a deep dive is needed, but there is a general understanding of what the core problems are. It is more about, and it is also not about just introducing new laws and regulations, but the point that was initially raised by Professor PPD about the de jure and de facto, about not just the legislation, but how that's actually being practiced on the ground. I think that's very interesting, and I think Alfredo has also agreed that this is an important point. And also in terms of the coordination, I think this came up not from the participant, but also from the questions that the participants read, but also the experts have recognized that the coordination is an issue, especially at the multilateral mechanisms, but also at national levels. And Ronan touched that on the sports and also in organized crime. I think the understanding that there are different agencies working to on the same issue, but there's no there's the lack of coordination means that it's happening as a piecemeal in a piecemeal approach. So having said that, I think the last question was also very useful to get your thoughts on how to build a more build participation from the people who actually can make the changes. And I think this is really important for the civil society to take back. And I think a lot of civil society are already doing this in terms of building alliances and sector based on sector as well as interest, and pushing for the agenda further. So thank you. And thank you for all the participants and the experts and who joined us today. Thank you for your time. You can continue to follow this using and share your thoughts using the hashtag C20 Summit. Thank you and have a good day, everyone.
Thank you very much.